why are you here? There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes, I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
Superman has been an enduring presence in popular culture for almost 80 years. It's not hard to see why. He has super strength, enough to carry mountains and monuments. He can fly all over the world and even into space. He is invulnerable to pain and injury, with a few exceptions. But are these things truly what we think of when we picture Superman? Other superheroes have similar or even greater abilities. Superman's great powers are not his defining characteristic. In the climax of Superman the movie, Lex Luthor informs our hero that he has launched 2 missiles. The first missile will strike the San Andreas Fault and cause a catastrophe that will reshape California to further Luthor's real estate enterprise. The second missile will strike Hackensack, New Jersey. Even with Superman's great speed, Luthor believes it would be too challenging to stop both. Superman makes a deal with Miss Tessmacher to stop the second missile first because her mother lives in New Jersey. Superman wants to go after the missile headed to California first because Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen are in danger there, but faced with death by kryptonite, he makes the pact with Miss Tessmacher. After being saved, he keeps his promise in spite of his misgivings. Besides further the plot, what has Superman done? He has made a series of moral choices. He has exercised his own moral judgment. Questions of morality are placed in a branch of philosophy broadly called ethics. Superman's defining characteristic is not his ability to fly or his great strength. The defining characteristic of this fictional character is that he always wants to do good. Earlier in the film, he tells Lois Lane that he stands for truth and justice. He says, in all sincerity, that he never lies. He rescues cats from trees for little girls. Superman is wholesome. So where does he fall in the wide spectrum of ethics philosophy, and what are ethics anyway? Well, ethics philosophy deals with what we should do, how we should behave, and what makes a good life. And while there are a great number of ethical systems, especially when taking various religious doctrines into account, most can be categorized into a few broader ethics systems, meaning moral standards for everyone. Virtue ethics places less emphasis on learning rules. It places importance on developing good habits of character. Virtue ethics has people wonder what someone virtuous would do in a moral crisis. Christians would ask, what would Jesus do? And fictional citizens of Metropolis might ask, what would Superman do? Duty ethics posits that human beings have clear moral obligations to one another and that the rightness of something is in the action itself. Superman made a promise to Miss Tessmacher, so he now has an obligation to stop the missile headed to New Jersey first. But Superman also acts under consequentialist ethics, specifically utilitarianism. When his choices lead to the death of Lois Lane, Superman faces something that duty ethics and virtue ethics often will not solve: a moral dilemma. A moral dilemma in ethics philosophy is not being faced with the choice between right and wrong. It is a situation in which a moral agent faces an ethical paradox. No matter what one does, they will be violating some ethical principle. Superman has been instructed by a hologram of his father, Jor-El, not to interfere with the course of human history. This is admittedly vague, considering all of our actions change history, if only slightly, but generally Jor-El meant that Superman should inspire and help, but not abuse his power to alter the flow of human events too greatly. Jor-El forbids it, perhaps because if Superman exercised too much control over Earth, the people would lose part of what makes them human. In contradiction to this, Superman's human father, Jonathan Kent, told his son that he was on Earth for a reason, meaning he has a special importance as it pertains to the course of human history. Superman has the ability to turn back time, but if he does this, he would violate the lessons he agreed to when he was instructed by Jor-El in the Fortress of Solitude. So what does this have to do with utilitarianism? Well, Superman eventually decides to change history and save the people of California, including Lois Lane. He concluded that breaking his implied promise to Jor-El was less important than the greater good of saving so many lives. Utilitarianism demands that moral agents take into account the benefit and harm to all people. By utilitarian standards, Superman feeling guilty about disrespecting the memory of his long-dead father pales in comparison to the potential lives saved. Utilitarianism can also lead down some darker paths. Some have misused it as justification to exploit a minority of people to make the lives of the majority better, but all ethical systems rely on the actor, the moral agent, not just the system. In other words, we can only trust someone with good, moral judgment. Superman is perceived as morally good because he usually exercises that judgment well. 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant helped popularize a common phrase in ethics philosophy: ought implies can. It's an ethical formula that claims a person, if morally obliged to perform a certain action, must also, logically, be able to perform it. For example, Jimmy Olsen might feel the need to save California, but he is not able to do that. He does not possess the power, resources, or knowledge. We cannot blame someone for things they cannot control. Ought implies can is widely accepted in philosophical circles, but it also creates challenging questions. If someone is born with certain limitations or chemical imbalances, is he as morally responsible for his moral judgments? We don't know a lot about Non, one of General Zod's subordinates, but Jor-El says that he is without thought. If Non is incapable of making rational decisions, how can we judge his actions and his association with Zod? Ought implies can. He ought to do good, but can he? Superman is in a unique position under this philosophical maxim. He can do almost anything, which means one could argue that he ought to do everything good in his power. For example, the most I can do to prevent war is protest in the streets, vote for candidates who share my values, or call my congressman. Superman can find and destroy all of the world's nuclear weapons, and he does this in Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Under the ought implies can maxim, Superman might feel morally obliged to do so if he believes the world is on the brink of nuclear annihilation. He might reason, I can do this, so I should do this. In addition to this, Superman is performing a utilitarian act. Representatives of the United Nations applaud his announcement, but they are all not in compliance with Superman's plan. In the film, nuclear weapons are still being fired, perhaps tested. Superman does not collect the weapons from the world's governments by their consent. He must be stealing some of them, maybe all of them. Superman knows stealing is wrong, but he judges the rightness of his action because of what he thinks is the overall good of everyone in the world. He makes a judgment based on the strong possibility that a nuclear war will happen in the near future, as far as anyone can make a reasonable prediction honestly, and he makes a choice. Superman uses utilitarian ethics every day because he is lying to the world about his identity every time he puts on glasses. He simply feels, perhaps correctly, that his lies are minor infractions compared to the good these lies will accomplish, maintaining a life as Superman. Remember when he told Lois that he never lies? That too was a lie. Even inaction is a moral choice. In Superman 2, the Man of Steel decides to abandon his life as a superhero in order to commit to a relationship with Lois Lane. He removes his powers with a machine in the Fortress of Solitude. Shortly thereafter, the President of the United States surrenders to General Zod, leaving the country and even the world in jeopardy. Clark Kent regrets his decision to no longer be Superman. As Clark, he could still help the world in his own limited way in the same manner that any human being can, but he was in a unique position to do significantly more good than the rest of us. But that brings up the question, does the fact that Superman can spend his days tirelessly saving others mean that he must do this? Before we judge him too harshly for what seems like a selfish decision, most human beings do not maximize our utility for good either. Most of us do not give away most of our income to the homeless, volunteer in soup kitchens and hospitals on our weekends, or always act with the world's best interests at heart before our own. The difference between our desire for our own lives and Superman's desire for his own life in Superman 2 is that our abilities are limited and individually unnecessary, whereas Superman's powers make him arguably the most important person in the world. But that still does not answer the question, does it? Why must Superman be forced to do these things and sacrifice a normal life with Lois Lane? If you believe Superman should be flying around doing good deeds all the time, simply because he can, and that is reason enough, you might believe in what is called a positive duty or a positive right. If you believe Superman does not have an inherent duty to do good deeds and save others simply because he can, and actually only has a duty to not do evil, then you believe in the concept of negative duty or negative rights. There is a scene in Superman 3 in which a corrupted form of kryptonite has altered Superman's personality. He is informed that a truck is about to fall off a bridge, but because he has been compromised, he decides to save them later and spend time with Lana Lang instead. When he shows up, the truck has already fallen. Under the theory of negative duty, one would argue that Superman did nothing wrong because he did not push the truck over the bridge or cause the accident. Negative duty says Superman had no obligation to help. He only had an obligation to not go around causing bridge accidents. Superman, under normal circumstances, seems to believe in positive duty. He has the ability to save the world, and not utilizing these powers would be a terrible waste. This brings up another question about Superman's moral obligations, though. Couldn't Superman save more people if he really wanted? Sometimes Superman is not Superman. Sometimes he is Clark Kent. And while you can certainly argue that journalists do important work, normal people can be journalists. But only he can be Superman. Couldn't Superman save hundreds or thousands more lives if he wore the blue and red suit all the time? Some would argue that Superman not only cannot, but should not save everyone, for a reason akin to a theodicy. A theodicy is an argument that explains why God permits evil to exist. One such theodicy relates to Superman, the argument for free will. Some theists believe that if God were to intervene in the day-to-day lives of human beings, we would no longer have free will, and that is why God permits evil to exist. Similarly, one could argue that if Superman worked 24/7 solving all of the world's problems, we would lose some of our humanity and our ability to progress as a species. Some might not be satisfied with that answer, especially considering the benefits of Superman versus the harm of no Superman. He would not tire as easily as, say, a police officer or a firefighter, people who have occupational obligations to rescue people. However, flying around the world at super speed, never interacting with people except to save them from volcanoes and such, would do Superman psychological harm that would cause irreparable damage to himself that would prevent him from functioning as Superman at all. Remember, the people of Metropolis and the fictional world in general trust Superman because they have come to rely on his judgment. If that judgment were compromised, well, you would not like that Superman. So realistically, for there to be a Superman at all, he should not be Superman all the time. Another argument in favor of Superman retaining his Clark Kent persona is a little more selfish but also reasonable enough. Shouldn't Superman get a day off? Nobody is paying him for his life-saving and sometimes world-saving services as Superman. His off hours are not even relaxing. When he is not Superman, he is working at the Daily Planet as Clark Kent, which is probably a demanding job in itself. We would not expect anyone else in the world to sacrifice every waking hour to their cause, but people expect so much from Superman because he is generally portrayed so altruistically, even compared to other popular superheroes. When people, and I'm talking about real-world people now, not fictional people, say that Superman as a character is unrelatable, that comes across as troubling. He's too powerful, some scoff. Yet Thor, Shazam, the Hulk, and others are similarly overpowered superheroes, but they usually do not garner as much criticism as unrelatable. Plus, even though Superman is incredibly powerful, writers usually give him villains of comparable abilities or amazing intelligence to stand up to him. He faces real threats to both Earth and to himself. So it stands to reason that a lot of the criticism comes from Superman's personality more than his powers. Superman is good, and the fact that this makes him unrelatable says a lot about us, and it's mostly bad. Lex Luthor calls Superman's desire to do good an imperfection. In the source material more than the movies, Luthor cannot conceive of a being that only wants to do good, and this makes the supervillain mistrust the Man of Steel. Luthor wants to expose Superman and discredit him. That is the basis for much of their rivalry. Denouncing Superman as too good does not make us realistic. It makes us Lex Luthor. It's okay to admire the Big Blue Boy Scout. There are worse characters than the man that always wants to do good. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, there are other benefits to pledging, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. I'll see you next week.